Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein and this is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I am delighted to welcome once again my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman, who is in residence in South Florida today. And a beautiful day, it looks like outside. And we understand that there's a blizzard in New York and the Northeast. So for those of you who are buried under feet and feet in snow, you do have our thoughts.
Yes.
Both Marc from Florida and me from California.
Deep empathy.
Hope it's a good Shabbos wherever you happen to be. So this morning we opened the book of Exodus and we're right in the middle. The book of Exodus, I think you can understand, has three sections. The first four parshiot tell the story of our enslavement in Egypt and then our liberation. It's mostly about the liberation. And the fourth one, Bishalach, which is the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, climaxes with that wonderful moment at the other side when we are finally free. The two middle parshiot, Yitro and Mishpatim, where we are this week, talk about the revelation of Mount Sinai and the giving of commandments to the people of Israel. And the last five parshiot talk about the creation of the Mishkan, the creation of the first shrine, the first worship place for the people of Israel. So right in the middle, the fulcrum of this book, are the moments of revelation, moments when God reveals God's self to the people of Israel. But more than God revealing God's self, it's more than just a mystical religious moment. It's more than a mystical union with God. What comes out of it is what we have this week is mishpatim, law, rules. This is the principal metaphor, the principal language in which Jewish religion expresses itself. If the purpose of Jewish religion is to take us out of Egypt, not just bodily, but spiritually, to make us free people, and the purpose of religion, Jewish religion, is to give us the tools to create the society which is the diametric opposite of Egypt. Egypt, a place where people are used, a place where people become chattel, they become objects of use. Instead, we envision a society in which people are deemed precious, infinitely precious, and valued unto themselves. Well, the way that the Jewish tradition understood that task was a slow, ameliorating, step-by-step journey. And that step-by-step journey is symbolized in the Torah by the journey across the wilderness, but it's carried out in mishpatim, in laws. Each law envisions a different way of life. Each law takes us from where we are to a higher place, to a different place. At least that's the vision of the Torah. And so it's through mitzvot, it's through commandments, through law, through measures of behavior that we are changed, that we are freed, that we are redeemed, that we move from slavery to freedom, that we move from Pharaoh's subjects to being God's subjects, and we move toward a life of holiness. And this week in Mishpatim, there's a whole slew of laws about everything that one can imagine. It begins with laws of slavery, which basically erase the institution of slavery on the whole. And then you get a whole set of laws about torts, about Jews suing Jews. You know, what happens if my ox gores your ox, if your ox gores my ox, if the fence that I put around my property breaks down, if fire goes from my property to your, all of the kinds of things people sue each other over. And then as we get to the end of the parsha, there's a series of religious rituals, including a discussion of some of the holidays. In the middle of that is the line that is the core of our eating code, our kashrut code. Lo tivashel gedi b'chalei v'imo. You don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. And so this morning, we're going to focus of all the laws in this parsha, and there certainly are lots of them. We're going to focus on that one, how Jews eat. Rabbi Gellman, how did Jews
Yes, Rabbi Feinstein.
How do you eat?
Look, we haven't talked about keeping kosher, you and I, ever on air. And I think it's time for us to lay it out there. You basically keep kosher, but not completely, because you know what real kosher is. And you're not in that world, but you're very close to it. I basically don't keep kosher, but I have my own issues with the law, and I think we should talk about it. So let me begin by sharing my Kashrut Dilemma. And let me argue against myself taking your position, and you correct me if it's a distortion of it, which is that keeping kosher is maybe the most important thing Jews can do because it identifies us. It's a daily ritual that reminds you that you're Jewish. It does a very important thing to our spiritual development, and that is it teaches us discipline. So it's not that you're not eating pork because it has trichinosis. There's no medical issue here anymore. It's about we just don't eat that. And that's how Jews behave. And that's a very strong argument, extremely strong. It builds into you a sense that everything that you do in your most important, intimate biology, which is to feed yourself, has to be in the service of God. I love that. I also love this don't boil a kid in its mother's milk for its non-kashrut, I'd say humanitarian, but animalitarian, its feeling of welfare and sympathy for animals under the category, which of course we both know as Tsar Baalei Chayim, the suffering of animals. The idea that you don't boil a kid in its mother's milk came as Nelson Gluck explained it to me, was in the old days, of course, there was no pure water. There was nothing. Water was full of parasites and bacteria. So the only way to cook something was to grill it over meat, to grill it over wood, to grill the meat over wood. And that required a lot of wood. You know, a barbecue requires a lot of wood. And there wasn't a lot of wood to do that. And it also took time. The fastest, most efficient way was the Chinese way to do a wok, but we hadn't invented that. So the other way was braising, which was you cook meat in liquid. And the way they did it is they'd slaughter the animal. There was a stomach. They would take milk from the animal first before slaughtering it, put the milk in the stomach, chop up some vegetables and some meat, and put it into the stomach, tie up the stomach, and hang it over a fire so that it was close enough so that the liquid would boil and cook the meat. It was the first example of gedämpfte Fleisch, of braised meat. And so that's how you cooked. But the problem is, emotionally, the idea of taking a little lamb and killing it and putting its meat in the stomach of its mother and cooking it was so horrific to the sensitive heart of the Torah, which I think comes directly from God, that it was prohibited. And it's one of a piece of shooing the mother bird away when you take the eggs, so that she shouldn't see you taking her eggs away. You can't yoke an ox and a donkey together because they're of different strengths, and it will be hard for the weaker animal. And of course, for shechita, you have to slaughter an animal quickly without suffering. There's all these examples of Tsar Baalei Chayim, and that's what this verse is about. But it was interpreted by the rabbis, not by Yossi HaGalilean, but most of them, as the commandment to not mix milk and meat. And then it got to be, well, okay, but if you eat milk, how long after can you eat meat? If you eat meat, how long after? And that gave rise, interestingly, to the Jewish, to Ratner's vegetarian deli and all the delis on the Lower East Side that were milchik vegetarian, because Orthodox Jewish workers could have a milchik lunch, and they would be clear halachically to have a fleishik dinner. So I like all of that. The problem, there are two big problems that have kept me from keeping kosher. One is real kashrut would have cut me off from most of the people I wanted to go out with, and I wanted to see, and I wanted to have as my friends. I couldn't eat in a restaurant that served treif if I was keeping kosher, even if I ordered the fruit plate or the fish, because it's a treif restaurant. And I knew that. And the idea that, well, but I'm making these accommodations, I don't eat the pork, it seemed to me more of a loophole than a commitment. And the second problem that I had is that I believe there's only one real issue in how we eat, and it isn't keeping kosher. The really only moral issue about how we eat is vegetarianism, and which of course is kosher if you're a vegetarian. And that's the way I viewed it. That I didn't think that God was happy, or satisfied in any way at all with me slaughtering an animal and causing it pain in death so that I could eat a kosher animal rather than a non-kosher animal. I think God probably would be pleased if I chose to eat a vegetable for lunch rather than a living animal that had to have pain and death. So for those reasons, and then finally, I think it's a third reason, is that the kosher meat industry is corrupt, and there's no other way to say it. And the agri-processor scandal, which was just horrid, of one of the big kosher processors of food being accused and indicted, and I think convicted, of terrible, terrible abuses of workers and others. And plus the enormous cost differential between kosher meat and non-kosher meat. All of those reasons have led me to want to be a vegetarian. And for several years I tried it. It wasn't good for my health because I ate too many carbs and sugars. And my doctor said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to eat protein. And right now in your life, the best way for you to get protein is meat. But basically, that's my view about kashrut. But to tell you simply, I feel guilty that I don't keep kosher, but I also would be angry if I did. That's my schizophrenia.
The great
there
moral,
it is.
The great Jewish moral dilemma.
How do you handle that?
I feel guilty if I feel guilty that I don't. I'd feel angry if I did.
Yes.
And that rubric can be applied to so many parts of life.
Yeah, pretty much everything.
There you go, everybody.
So how do you deal with it?
Well, I first of all, I really I really appreciate and enjoy the way that you set this up. Okay.
Oh, good.
I think it's Parshat Mishpatim. It's a whole long list of law, and Jewish tradition sets itself out in terms of law. We talk about halakha as a way of life. And the great question of law is the question, of course, raised by Maimonides. Do laws have reasons behind them? Or are they simply to be observed because God said so? Right? I once asked an Orthodox friend, why do you keep kosher? And his answer was very clever. He said, because it's the best way I know not to eat treif. And what he meant by that was simply that the reason I keep kosher is because I'm told to keep kosher. And this is my loyalty to Torah and to tradition and to God. And so I do it. Of course, Maimonides in the 11th century already says, or the 12th century already says, that if you think God gave us commandments that have no reasons, you're thinking of God as the most foolish despot who ever lived. These mitzvot have reasons. Even in the Gemara, even in the Talmud, the great scholar Rav says, you think God cares how I kill an animal? It's really all about the kind of human being it makes me. My teacher, Harold Schulweis, used to talk about the teleology of halacha. It's a fancy way of saying, what kind of human being does this make me into? And I think what you said was beautiful. Our relationship to food is a principal symbol and a principal expression of our relationship to nature and to the world of life. And the question is, how do I relate to nature and the world of life? And the way I'm going to relate to my own food is symbolic and expressive of my relationship to nature and the world of life. So if I revere life, if uvacharta v'chaim, choose life, if guarding and protecting the sanctity of life is at the core of my Jewishness, of my Jewish ethics, then it's going to affect the way that I eat. It's going to shape and change the way I eat, because the way I decide to eat is going to symbolize and also motivate that and teach that expression of how I'm going to relate to the world of life. Now, I think that you had it exactly right. If you open the Tanakh, you open the Torah, in the beginning, we were meant to eat fruit and vegetables, not even vegetables, by the way, just fruit, because the difference is that if you eat an apple, the tree is still alive. If you eat an asparagus, you've uprooted something. You're not supposed to kill. You're not supposed to kill. And it's only after the flood in Genesis that God says, all right, you want hamburgers? You wrote a beautiful midrash about this. I've taught that midrash so many times. It's only that after the flood that God says, you have a desire in you to kill. So I'm going to compromise and allow you to express that through the eating of meat. Anthropologists tell us that the problem was protein, much like you had in your own personal life. We needed sources of complex proteins. Okay, now, first of all, in terms of being a vegetarian, I'm not sure that's true anymore, because now you can get plenty of complex proteins from the food that we eat. But that was the kashrus was an ethical compromise with the ethical ideal of vegetarianism and of not killing altogether. And it was a system of compromise. And I've kept kosher most of my life. There have been some years of my life when I didn't. When I was in college, I ate all kinds of things. But most of my life, I've been in some fashion kosher. And I don't find it an obstacle to my participation in social life with people outside. It's true. I lived in Texas for 8 years. And it was only in Texas that I found restaurants where the only thing I could order was a cup of coffee, right? Like even the salad had bacon on it, you know?
What about barbecue brisket?
Yeah, well, we got kosher barbecue brisket is what we did. We found it. So, but most of the time, I find it perfectly easy to be kosher, especially these days when there's so many dietary restrictions. I mean, my family comes to dinner. You know, one of them is gluten-free. One of them is a vegetarian. One of them is a vegan. One of them doesn't eat fish. By the time I cook a meal for Shabbos, it's like there's 8 different meals being served on the thing. And here in California, there is such an emphasis on health, and there's such a predilection toward vegetarianism that it's very easy to find food these days. It was harder when I was young, but it's much easier now. So I don't find that that's an obstacle. It's not easy. And I have to say, I mean, so everyone wonders, does the rabbi ever? Yes, I do. You know, when I walk by a Kentucky Fried Chicken place and smell that smell, yes, for a moment I say to myself, master of the world, you couldn't have made chicken parve. You made fish parve. You couldn't have made chicken parve, you know? Yes, I think about these things. Yes, it's true. But look, to me, this is an important expression of an ideal, of a value that means the world to me. The mitzvah that's written in the Torah, you will not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Now, Nelson Gluck was the great anthropologist, great scholar of ancient Judaism. I take this as an ethical statement. Yeah. Milk is what mothers give babies. Milk represents nurturing. Milk represents the power we share with all that is alive in the world to bring life into the world and to nurture. Meat requires taking life. Meat requires killing something. This symbolizes to me the two impulses within my soul, within my personality, within my animality, as it were. I have the impulse to protect and nurture life. I have the impulse to kill and destroy life. I have an impulse toward violence, right? Freud called it eros and thanatos, right? Love and death. And we have that inside of us. And what Torah is trying to tell us is you are to expand and to generate and to enhance that life-giving impulse, and you're to delimit the life-taking impulse. That's the great ethical problem. And the separation of milk from meat, of milchik and fleishik on my plate and on my kitchen and in my pots and pans is simply a symbol of this great ethical task. Can I separate the life-taking from the life-giving in me? Can I separate that? The example that I've always given when kids ask me this, I have a long conversation with my students. You go to a movie and you see the governor of California was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's the highest paid actor in Hollywood. And Schwarzenegger was not paid so much because of his beautiful, nuanced expressions of the human soul. No. It's because he carried out violence in the most entertaining way that we've ever had. You know, Rocky Balboa, Sylvester Stallone, and all the violence. We get this entertaining charge out of witnessing violence. And that, I think, is exactly what the Torah is trying to teach us not to do. Not to associate violence with something that is desirable. If violence is necessary to stay alive, if violence is necessary to protect yourself, that's one thing. But if violence becomes nurturing, it becomes attached to the life-giving part of us, there's something deeply wrong with that.
Well, I agree. So how do you justify eating meat?
Right?
How do you justify eating even kosher meat?
Right. Well, the problem with the corruption of the kosher food industry.
So forget that. You're
no,
still
that's a problem.
taking...
That's not a small problem. That's not
no, it isn't. But let's first focus on. I agree. I love that the way you set it up, and I think it's beautiful and true and right. And it's why I believe that what I'm struggling to reach is a kind of vegetarian acceptance, where I'm not causing death.
Well, then I think that vegetarianism is something that we should move toward, right?
Right.
I think vegetarianism is exactly the ideal. Not all of us are ready to take on that as a discipline because it's difficult. So this is one more ethical principle of Torah. Sometimes we're going to be inconsistent. We're going to be inconsistent because it's difficult, it's inconvenient. It's going to be inconsistent because of health reasons. We're going to be inconsistent because we're just not ready to make that move. Right? I would like to give more tzedakah, but I'm inconsistent about that, right? Because I'm still one of these fearful people who holds on to his wallet too tightly, right? I would like to be a kinder, gentler person, but I'm inconsistent because I lose my temper sometimes. And moral inconsistency is part of being human, but the process of tshuva, of working towards something that is an acknowledged ideal, is an important element of our ethics. So if you say, someday I'll be a vegetarian, I'm just not ready to do it right now.
Right.
I accept that. I think that's good. See, there has to be a moral floor. Let's understand that, right? I'm faithful to my wife and I'm not inconsistent about that. That I can assure you. But in terms of an ideal, of a moral ideal that's as high as vegetarianism, it's a moral aspiration. And someday I hope to get there. I'm working on it. I'm not there yet. It takes.
Yeah, we're in agreement on that. And I think the way I fit that into my world and the way it encourages me to continue to struggle and grow is that we inherit a Torah that isn't inconsistent and doesn't codify our inconsistencies, but rather a Torah that's actually given on several levels. It's the idea that vegetarianism is clearly the preferred way in the Torah from Genesis 1 to Genesis 9. That's very clear. And it's saying, look, and it's also, you see it in the laws of warfare, saying, okay, you shouldn't be fighting wars, but if you fight wars, don't cut down your enemy's fruit trees. They aren't combatants, and it's a crime against nature. So I love the fact that the Torah offers us a low Torah, which is eating meat, make it kosher, don't eat blood in it, and then don't eat meat and don't cause death so you can have lunch. But the problem still remains, leaving aside the huge meta halakhic problem, which is I can name you 50 laws right now that are given in the Torah and that are codified by the rabbis, and you don't follow them and you don't want to follow them and you won't follow them. The laws about not counting a woman in a Beit Din, or not allowing a woman to read from the Torah, not allowing a woman to be a rabbi, the laws about homosexuality. There's lots of things that you can't use the overarching, this is what God commanded, the Orthodox thing. That doesn't work for me, and it doesn't work for you. I know. So the question I have is, what are you really doing when you go out with friends and you eat in a restaurant that isn't kosher? What do? You're eating something but you're not keeping kosher.
No, I am, but let's take the general problem, then we'll come to the specific, okay? I can construct two extreme positions. On the one hand, I can say everything God has told us I'm going to do. Na'aseh v'nishma, says the Torah. Everything that is commanded, I'm going to do. And I'm going to follow each and every one of these laws to the letter, and I'm going to bend my will, actually destroy my will, in order to observe each and every one of these laws. That's one way of looking at it. And the other way of looking at it is saying, I am morally autonomous. I make my own decisions. You can recommend whatever you want to me, but I'm the one in the end that makes my own decisions. Moral heteronomy and moral autonomy. Moral obedience and complete autonomy and independence. I'm trying to stake out a position in the middle. And I acknowledge, because every position in the middle is dialectical and contradictory and inconsistent and difficult. But it's a position in the middle that says, I am going to learn from my tradition. I'm open enough and humble enough to listen carefully to the voice of God that comes through the Torah and the voice of the tradition that comes through the Torah and its wisdom and its moral aspiration. And at the same time, I know that I have to make the ultimate decision about what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. Is this un-Jewish? No, I think it is Jewish, because remember, Abraham says to God, you can't kill all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. There might be 50 good people in the city. Hasofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, which means that there is a standard of justice that even God has to follow. And God says, okay, you're right. You find me 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And God gives in the end, because God recognizes that Abraham's moral reasoning and moral autonomy ought to have a voice in this dialectical conversation. And that to me is critical in figuring out how to live as a moral person and as a Jew. I'm open to listen to the voice of my tradition. My kids criticize me all the time. I listen to their voices. My friends and students criticize me, not criticize in a bad way. They teach me. They teach me. They lift me up. They recommend new ways of thinking about the world. And I become concerned, and then I have to make a decision. And it's the space between pure autonomy and pure heteronomy that moral life lives. In this case, there are strictures of halacha, strictures of law. And if I were keeping them 100% strict, yes, perhaps I would never eat in a restaurant except if it were kosher. And then I would have to go interrogate the mashgiach and make sure he's kosher enough. You're right. On the other hand, if I go to a restaurant and I say, I know that the food cooked in this restaurant is not kosher, I'm going to take foods that can be cooked in a kosher way, like fish, like vegetables. I'll eat vegetarian out. Is everything cooked in this restaurant kosher? Could a piece of something treif have fallen? Yes, I know that could happen, but I also have a value of wanting to be part of a community. I also have a value of wanting to enjoy the gifts of life. And I want to keep as kosher as I can. And as kosher, so I add a step of kosher by choosing certain things on the menu and not choosing other things on the menu, by choosing certain restaurants and not other restaurants, by eating in places that I know are very careful about how they prepare the food. Right? I had a wonderful experience in an Indian restaurant when I explained to the waiter who sent over the chef that what my eating habits are. And he said, oh, you're a Buddhist. And I said, good enough, good enough. He said, oh, I know what to make for you. You're a Buddhist, because he knew that there's a certain sects of Buddhism that are very careful about their vegetarianism. Yeah, all right, you're right. It's inconsistent. I'm not going to, that's my way of doing it. But it doesn't mean that I let go of the aspiration, by the way, because I'm very careful about where I choose to eat and where I choose not to eat. So and I don't think that my inconsistency, here's where I object, Mark, and I'm not going to criticize you because, I deeply, deeply, deeply respect your morality and your adherence to tradition. But to say, because I'm inconsistent, I'm going to throw the whole system out.
No.
Doesn't make any sense either.
You misunderstand me. That's not my argument. My argument is that once you reach the point that you beautifully articulated, that we are not operating in a halachic framework, neither you nor I. We're operating in an autonomous framework. we are making the decisions about what we will do and what we won't do, what parts of the tradition we will take up, what parts we won't take up. We're in agreement on that. The question is, what is our thinking about whether to take or leave? And I don't want to say it again, but to me, the only argument is, do you have to kill something to have lunch? And the answer is clearly no. But if you have to kill something, so you kill it and you eat it, and that's a lower level.
And you kill it in a way that's moral.
Right. Well,
try not to create pain for the animal. You try not to.
Right. So this is my pushback on that point. If you were convinced, and I'm not saying you are, but if I could show you ways of slaughtering animals that are more humane than traditional shechita,
I would make that shechita.
Right. And if I could show you that, that the enterprise of kosher meat is deeply corrupt, and I know the conservative movement did some wonderful things about trying to correct that. That would also affect it. But my question is,
wait, can I just interrupt for just a quick second? But you see, I don't know if you've ever read Fast Food Nation.
Yes, of course.
Because the whole factory farming system is, and it's, by the way, not just meat, although the meat is the worst when you talk about these basically these horrible feedlots with animals, but even the crops that we're raising, with the amount of chemicals that are dumped on them, with the hydrocarbons that are expended to create these things, and the runoff into rivers. I mean, the more conscious you become about the food we eat, the more difficult the whole system becomes to accept.
Right. No, I agree. But so the question is still, what in your mind is the difference spiritually between a slaughtered kosher cow and a slaughtered non-kosher cow?
The difference is that somebody who slaughtered that cow was concerned that that cow wouldn't suffer. The difference is that that cow, the way that that cow is prepared, symbolizes these values for me, these values of life and protection of life, and that they.
You mean that it's salted so that the blood comes out?
Blood is taken out, and that it's prepared and served separated from milk. That these are symbolic of my values. This is my value language, and that the animal was cared for in a little bit better way than it would have been cared for otherwise. Now, is it really cared for that way? I don't know. And the more I understand about,
I love you, and I accept that, and
the more I understand that this factory farming bothers me. I mean, it really does.
No, I see that, and I understand that. The issue really, I think, comes down to the question of how high on the moral scale can we pitch our diet? How high can we do that?
Well, the question is this: I have an aspiration. I have an image, a vision of what I'd like. Now the question is, how high am I prepared to move toward that aspiration? What am I prepared to sacrifice to get closer and closer to that aspiration? But I'm not giving up the aspiration. I'm not giving up the goal.
Let me ask you, Eddie. You said, does this one of the reasons you mentioned is that it helps make us better people, following halacha.
The Talmud says that.
Yeah, and I've always been intrigued by that, and unfortunately, working as president of the New York Board of Rabbis and seeing some of the abuses that came across my desk in the Orthodox community of slumlords and other things, other abuses, you begin to ask yourself, wait a minute, if following halacha makes you a better person, why am I looking at all of these cases of halachic Jews who are basically moral monsters? So I have to open in my own life the question, what makes you a better person? And the idea that you're not having a cheeseburger, and I don't mean to trivialize that. I mean, with all of the understanding of life from milk and not what you beautifully said, but if you're feeling that not eating a cheeseburger makes you a better person, you are open, you are vulnerable to the counter argument which I'm raising, that it isn't true, Ed. What makes you better is doing better things. What makes you better is choosing life. What makes you better isn't having a garment that doesn't mix wool and linen and violate the Shatnez commandment, avoiding a cheeseburger. I'm not sure that that's a way to higher moral living, but I'm truly not sure.
No, I certainly appreciate the question, and I too, when you read about for the agro processing catastrophe and so many other catastrophes where people who are very observant Jews come out doing very immoral things, and it makes you nauseous because you say this is everything that the tradition is teaching us not to do, and yet doesn't seem to be a connection between this person's observance of religious law and the morality that it's supposed to be teaching, and the moral qualities that are supposed to be imbibed, that are supposed to be encouraged and enriched and nurtured by these observances. Yeah, that hurts. You're exactly right. On the other hand, I have found in my own life and in the life of my family, for example, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, when we first put a computer in the house, and my son, who was 13 at the time, found some things online that you wouldn't expect a rabbi's kid to find. He's a healthy 13-year-old kid, right? And I come in and I see him looking at this, and I stop him and I say, "What are you doing?" And he's very embarrassed. I said, "Then don't be embarrassed. Healthy kid, and I understand why that's attractive to you. Let's talk about it." And I could use the language of treif. I could say, there are things in the world which are desirable, but we know they're wrong. And they're wrong because they deny the fundamental values that we learn by. I said, that young woman, she may be enormously gorgeous, but she has a soul. And by looking only at the contours of her body, you have forgotten that she is a human being, that she has a soul, that she has an inner life, that she has a preciousness, and that we're not permitted to use her in the way that we use implements, we use objects. And you objectify somebody, that's called treif. That's exactly the language of not kosher. So it gives me a moral language to express to my kid something which is difficult to express. It's a moral language. We need a moral language in this culture to talk about life and death. We need a moral language to talk about nature and the natural world that we live in. And kashrus is a moral language that one can use to extend into all of these other areas. Does it work for everybody? No, there are people that think that if I just observe the law to the letter, I can abuse people left and right. I think that's treif. I think that's mixing milk and meat. That's mixing things that have no right to be mixed up together. And are there laws of the Torah that make no sense to me at all? Absolutely. Of course, and I am a careful student of these things, and I'm open to them. So I think you agree to this too, though. I do. I know you are. Yeah. I know you teach this. So I think, but this is we need this idea of a moral language is very important to me, because.
And I think the other thing I want our viewers to go away with, our students, our friends, is your concept of aspirational, that the Torah can't be something dead and fixed. It has to be something that you aspire to, something that you use to lift you up from one moral level to a higher moral level.
Right.
If you're eating meat every day, maybe thinking about these issues will lead you to eat meat once a week.
Right.
And
or try an Impossible Burger.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, I think, comforting, and it's ennobling to have a sacred scripture that isn't fixed, but open and encouraging.
demands your intelligence to read it, and
Yes.
demands your moral sensitivity to engage it, and demands that you learn how to make moral decisions. Look, the central metaphor of Torah is a journey. We're moving. The whole Torah is about moving. It's a dynamic text. It's moving. In this case, the metaphor is a mountain. You're moving up. It's all about aspiration.
Right.
And it all recognizes that I'm not where today, I'm not where I want to be tomorrow, but I'm on the right direction. I know where I'm going, and I'm trying hard. And I think
that's
that kind
true.
of moral aspiration is very important.
And one final point from me, and that is one thing I love about the halakhic system and the way it embeds itself in Judaism, is that it's a populist system. That is, its intention is to be aspirational for all Jews. It doesn't cut off and elevate a certain class of priests or others for whom, they're the ones who really do it, and they're the ones who have the aspirations. Like the Buddhist monks are celibate, but a Buddhist isn't. Tom Hartman was celibate, and regular Catholics aren't. And the idea that you have a veneer of really holy people who follow a really holy law, and then you have the what they call in Buddhism the householders. That to me, because that's absent in Judaism, that's one of the great traits of Judaism, that it's for all of us. There's nothing, for example, that you and I are commanded to do as rabbis that an ordinary, regular Jew who's not a rabbi is commanded to do. The same law for you is for me is for them.
Yeah.
I love that.
And how many times have people told you, I don't have to keep kosher because I'm not a rabbi?
Well, I know.
Right. Well, the other thing I'll add one more point to finish with as well, which we didn't get to, which is the very fact that think about the role of food in Jewish celebration. I mean, if you, the joke about going, to a Jewish wedding, and not eating for a month after that. I mean, food has a powerful effect on us because it is a symbol of life. And I think, the notion, the Jewish tradition of eating well and making food part of our celebration. We're not an ascetic people.
No.
We don't practice, even with kashrus, we don't practice a consistent self-denial, right? People fast on Yom Kippur, but the poor people, they spend the whole day talking about what they're going to break fast on. You'll bring the white fish, you bring the lox, I'll bring the bagels, But the idea that there is a celebration, that there's a meal, that a bris comes with a meal, bar mitzvah has a meal, a wedding has a feast.
Oneg Shabbat.
Even a shiva has a meal, and oneg Shabbat. The idea, because there is the wonderful commandment at the beginning of Genesis when God says to Adam, achol tochal, enjoy the world. Enjoy the world that you've been given. Cherish the experience of being a sensual being in the world and enjoy it.
The psalmist quote, Tamu ura'u ki tov Adonai. Taste and see that the Lord is good.
So I'll wish everybody a good morning. Go off and have breakfast now. Have your second cup of coffee, have a piece of Danish, and enjoy it. And enjoy all the gifts of life. Thank you for being part of our Torah study this morning. Following this, we have prayers 10 o'clock from Valley Beth Shalom. We hope that you'll join us for that. Tonight, 5 o'clock, Yossi will be leading Minyan. Tomorrow, Sunday, morning Minyan at 8:30 on Facebook and YouTube, not in person, and same at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then Monday through Friday, in person and on Facebook and YouTube, morning Minyan at 7:30, evening Minyan at 5. This week, we have Lunch and Learn on Wednesday at 12:30. You can sign on to the Zoom or to Facebook and YouTube. We're learning Talmud together. And Wednesday evening, at 7 o'clock, we continue with the College of Jewish Studies here from VBS. Our topic this year is called Pro-Israel, No Israel, all about Israeli culture. We want people who are passionate lovers of Israel to really understand how Israelis live and what makes their lives so very special. This week and next week, we're going to be online, and our guest is Mr. Sagi Raphael, who is a wonderful art curator, an art dealer, a scholar of Israeli art. who's going to show us the Israeli identity through Israeli art, contemporary Israeli art. So please join us at 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening for that. Marc, thank you. Have a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, Ed.